Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Willard Preacher Podcast. I'm Matt, and I'm joined by Gary Cattell, who is known as the Willard Preacher, who is a regular fixture on the Penn State campus. How are you, Gary?
I'm doing well, and you?
Also well, thank you. So tonight we're going to focus on, I would say, just generally the question of creation and evolution. Just sort of how does that all fit together? How should we engage that, and so on. A couple episodes ago, of course, you had a nice debate with a friend of ours, Kunal, who is an atheist. And sort of after we were finished, he said, I have this video of Matt Walsh, and he's talking about why he is not a young Earth creationist. He basically, Kunal was saying, what do you guys think about this? And so we've decided to kind of take that and take parts of it and maybe play it and talk about it, engage some of those ideas as well. So that's kind of where we're standing with that. So Gary, is there anything you want to say as sort of as a preface, as sort of preparatory remarks with regards to this issue of, understanding science, understanding creation, or understanding evolution versus a Christian view, those sorts of things?
First of all, I just like to say that it's not like, this is the second time we've used a Matt Walsh video and we've disagreed with it. So I'll make it clear that's not, we don't like Matt Walsh.
Mm-hmm.
We do. I think we both like What is a Woman documentary. Was very good. I thought, if anybody hasn't seen that's good to see. But like you said, this one, Kunal said he'd like to see it, and we thought maybe others would also. I don't know if there's any preparatory, prefaces here. I think I can just kind of pick them up as we go on.
Okay.
So we can just, and we're not anti-science. Science when it does science is good. The scientific method, when it's looking at the world and what's happening in the world or what's happening in the universe, and it can see things and it can experiment on it, it can reproduce it and so on. I think we both think that there's a very good method. Mm-hmm. Problem with that and this is that nobody was there to see it. And so it's essentially, I guess I do have preparatory preface. So anyhow, nobody was there to see it. So you basically have to use forensic science. So you're looking at the way the forensic science works is, as far as I understand it, you look at what you didn't see in light of what you have seen. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think. I think this falls short. Modern science falls short because, and what I mean by that is, if you see somebody laying on their back with a bullet in their chest, right, and you just stumble upon them one day, you didn't see what happened, but you've seen that, or we as humans have seen that before. So we know somebody shot him, even though we didn't see it. And so if you're going to do this sort of science, which is very difficult to do, as we'll see, you have presuppositions and everything else that have to be right. And you can't prove your presuppositions to be right, but you have to be able to say, okay, what have we seen and how can we relate that to what we haven't seen? Well, what we see is, every time we see a structure, even a simple structure that has order, complexity, and usefulness, some living being has created it. So whether it's an anthill, a bee's nest, a bee's nest, a bird's nest, a beehive, groundhog tunnels, beaver dams, spider's web, whatever it is, some living being has made it. It just doesn't happen. We don't see a bird's nest in a tree and think, well, we've seen that happen on its own, just because stuff happens. We've seen birds do that. So we're not sure how that got there, but we know a bird's living in it now. Mm-hmm. Or one example that Michael Behe used, he was at Penn State many years ago, and he wrote Darwin's Black Box or something like that, professor at Lehigh, and I don't know, I think he's a intelligent design, but what, it doesn't really matter. But he said, if you're walking down a path in the woods and you see a bunch of twigs put together to spell the word love, nobody thinks it just happened. Natural forces. Nobody said, oh, look what natural forces did.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We all think somebody, not a bear, not a deer, not a squirrel, some human being old enough to get around, old enough to gather the twigs, old enough to know how to spell, and old enough to have put them together, made that simple 4-letter word. So in our real life, we don't believe even the simplest structures happen by chance. But now we're supposed to believe the entire universe and all the life in it just happened.
Mm-hmm.
So people will say to me, they'll say, "Oh, you Christian types, you're just so simplistic that you don't know what happens. You just say God did it." And okay, yeah, we say God did it. That's right. Can't argue that. But I could come back to them and say, "But you guys are so simplistic. You just say stuff happens."
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the scientific creation myth in a nutshell. If they're going to boil ours down to God did it, we can boil theirs down to stuff happens, because they don't believe any intelligent being at all had anything to do with any of this. So that's just as simplistic as ours is, but far more unbelievable when you look at how everything actually works in real life. So I don't think they do the forensic science very well, and I don't think real life bears out what they're saying. Another thing they say is they'll say, well, science. They'll say, you guys, you Christian types, you have your doctrine, and you're just stuck in the mud. No matter what evidence we put out there, you're going to stay with your doctrine. Okay, and if it's really Christian doctrine, we're going to stay with it, and we don't believe the evidence will show us anything different. But they say, we scientists, or the scientists, they say, if you give them evidence and you give them enough evidence, they'll change. And maybe that's true given enough time. There's always resistance, but given enough time, maybe that's true. But then they'll come back and say, they'll turn right around and say, but if you don't agree with us on evolution or the Big Bang or abiogenesis or even climate change or whatever, then you're a science denier. Well, I thought you just said science can be wrong. And now you're telling us if we challenge it, we're science deniers because it can't be wrong. So there's a lot of problems like that. And the one, I'm sure I'll bring up many times as we go through this, and this is the main problem, is that when you're looking at origins, you've got two possibilities: God or no God. So modern science has decided that they're not going to bring God into science. They say, you can't bring God into science. You can't test for God. You can't put God under a microscope. You can't. So we have to leave God out of science. Now, older science didn't do that, but modern science does. And that's fine when you're just looking at the world and seeing how it works, right? You don't have to bring God into it. But when you're looking at origins, that's half the possibilities. So when you exclude half the possibilities before you even start, and you call that science, in no other realm of science could you do that. All right, there's two possibilities. We're just going to exclude. A friend of mine said that's like saying we're going to catalog all the life in the world, but we're not going to look in the oceans. You can't just exclude half the possibilities. And you don't have to test for God. You don't have to put God under a microscope. You look at the universe and all the life in it, and you come to the conclusion that you don't think it could have happened on its own, which is a valid conclusion that somebody could come up with. You just brought God into science. Didn't have to be a specific God. Didn't have to be the first chapter of Genesis, which we're going to look at tonight. But you brought God into it just by saying you don't think it could have happened on its own. Just like you look at the bird's nest and say it couldn't happen on its own. The beehive, it couldn't happen on its own. The anthill couldn't happen on its own. The universe, if the simple structures can't happen on their own, the more complex structures aren't going to happen on their own. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's my non-preface preface.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to add a couple of things as well. So I was a high school science teacher for 11 years. So I, again, not anti-science, not ignorant of science. I think probably, the person who's really dug in as far as believing in science to the point where they will not consider other possibilities. That is that's fine for if that's where they are, that's where they are. I think what's more challenging, and that's kind of interesting as far as what we're going to look at with Matt Walsh is, he's almost taking a position of, well, gosh, if I don't affirm this science is so rock solid. If I don't affirm this science, then I'm afraid of being some sort of kooky religious person who's a science denier, and as we'll see, says things like, we have to say that cosmology and astronomy and geology are all just a bunch of nonsense if we don't accept, if we're either a young Earth believer or some sort of creationist or something like that. So for my part, I think what I also, as we're sort of talking through this, I want us to just make the point that it's not preposterous to view the possibility that God created everything, or that he did it in a short period of time or a long period of time or whatever, that those possibilities are not, someone is not ridiculous for holding that view. And in fact, if you start digging into the science of it, because we haven't seen these things in the beginning, that's a conjecture. And so we're going to break down all of that as well. Now, as far as where's Matt Walsh coming from, I believe he's a Roman Catholic. He's made it clear. Now, this is a 4-year-old video, so maybe his views have shifted in some ways. I would hope that probably his trust in the scientific consensus has shifted a little bit since we've gone through a pandemic and this other stuff that maybe should make us question that a little bit. But so he's a Roman Catholic, but he's made it clear that he's not a young Earth creationist. Some of his views are pretty interesting. Some of his views, it's just an opportunity for us to discuss and talk about it. So that's where he's coming from. And so let's start.
Yeah, one more thing off what you were saying, sure, real quick. I think one of the problems that I've seen with Christians, my fellow Christians, when it comes to this sort of thing, is that back in the day, religion was at the top rung of the ladder. And if there was a life question, you went to the religious leaders. And if there was a consensus amongst the religious leaders, that's what you went with. Mm-hmm. And people say, oh, I'm glad we're not there. I'm glad we're not there. And we don't just take their word for it or whatever. What's happened now is that science is at the top rung of the ladder. And we're doing the exact same thing. We're not checking their research. We're not checking their funding. We're not checking their experiment. We're not checking anything. Mm-hmm. If they say it, we just say, okay, well, the science says, so that must be it, right? So I think what happens with us Christians sometimes is that, and at the same time, religion is way down the bottom rung of the ladder, mm-hmm, right? Religion can't be trusted. And I think that seeps in, secularism seeps in from everywhere. It's tough to keep it all out. I think that seeps in. And so when you, especially with Galileo and the things that happened in the past, and the Catholic Church denying, that the earth revolved around the sun or whatever. Because when you look up in the sky, it seems the opposite. And so they said, well, we can't, if science conflicts with religion, we've got to take the place of science, because we don't want to be like they were back then. We don't want to be these ignorant people that just went with their religion, even though all the evidence was there. So I think we get susceptible to the prejudices of the culture. And we don't want to be seen as those backward religious people. So we try to, so when there's this conflict between the religion and science, we tend to want to go with the science and say, well, the religion has to change. The religious outlook has to change. Mm-hmm. Now, I think as was one of the, well, we'll wait till we see if we get there. But sometimes that might be the case. But it's something like this, when you're talking about origins, only God was there. Mm-hmm. If the Christian God is the true God, as Matt Walsh believes, and we believe, then the Christian God knows what happened. Mm-hmm. And he's the one that can reveal it. Now we'll see some of Matt Walsh's objections. He believes first chapter of Genesis is true. And he believes the Christian God is the God. But I think what he's trying to do is what many try to do, is take the first chapter of Genesis and try to meld it in with modern science.
Yeah.
So we'll see how he tries to do that.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make, which is because that science is at the top rung, then it's necessary to shoehorn that science into it without ever really examining just how strong that those scientific claims really are. Of course, Galileo, that you bring up Galileo, we hardly speak at all about anything related to religion in public school, but we talk about Galileo, and of course, as Orthodox Christians, we're not that concerned with how the Roman Catholic Church dealt with Galileo. It's of course is described as, the religious fundamentalists being so backwards and so on. And I think that definitely gets painted with that type of brush, regardless of what the actual history was like. So we're afraid of that sort of viewpoint. But I think what we're here to say is that you don't need to be afraid of that. So
no, I think there's answers to it. And Matt Walsh is basically, as we'll see, is just giving the normal objections to young Earth creationism. So this isn't something that, so if you think that our response to him is a good one, that's pretty much going to take into account all the objections to young Earth, at least a good part of them.
Right. The final thing that we'll say before we turn the clip on is, so this is about a 44-minute video. We've dealt with longer videos before, so we will post the entirety. We'll post a link to the whole video, but we're just going to be looking at a few clips. So we're not trying to cherry pick his arguments. We're not trying to cut him in a way that is not fair to him. And if you think that that's the case, then we'll make sure we include that link so that any viewers can watch that themselves.
And you can write to us and you can tell us, and if you're right and we did that, we will correct it, because it's always best to take the best arguments from the side that's opposing you and deal with that. To caricature them and knock down the caricature doesn't do anybody any good. It's the easiest thing in the world to do, and atheists do that all the time with Christianity. They make this caricature of Christianity and then they knock it down. We're always trying to say, no, that's not really Christianity. And so we don't want to do the same thing with somebody from, and Matt Walsh isn't an atheist, obviously, but in this case, somebody who's an old Earth creationist. Now, the other thing I need to say, preface this, is that he didn't say exactly what he believes about the Big Bang, abiogenesis, which is life from non-life, and evolution. He never said that. So we don't know exactly what he believes on that. So we're just dealing with what he has said.
Yeah. Yeah. And since Kunal asked us to look at it, it's of interest.
Yeah.
So let me share this. I have his sound. Here we go. So we're starting a few minutes in, and so he's really talking here about is Genesis a science textbook? That's kind of the very first bit, right?
Before we start on that, the first part of this, the first like however long, 7 minutes, 50 seconds, whatever, he was generally just giving the intro, and part of the intro was he was having this discussion on Twitter with young Earth creationists. And he was essentially saying that's not a good format to have this sort of discussion with. And so this is why he wanted to, put this out there. And I agree, trying to argue these things out on Twitter or Facebook, usually, because neither side really reads closely what the other person is saying. They're just responding to what they think they said, and it tends to break down. So anyhow, that's why he's doing the video.
And this, of course, is a few years ago, so he's filming from his car. He's a little bit higher class these days.
Yes.
But we like him all the same. Okay, here we go.
So now we ask: what genre is Genesis? Is it meant to be read? Is it a science textbook? Is it meant to be read as a precise scientific account of the origins of the universe? Is that why Genesis is there? Is that what God wants us to take from it? Does he want us to study it like we study a science book? Of course, he wants us to study it, but is it to be studied as a science textbook? If you were to isolate Genesis and put it in a section of the bookstore by itself, would it be in the science section? Do you think that Genesis should or can be used as a reference for serious geological and cosmological study? Could a theoretical physicist...
That's probably a good place to stop for that clip. How would we respond to that? That's an interesting way.
I respond to it by saying, no, it's not a science textbook, it's a history textbook. Right? God isn't telling us what he did. He's not, using the scientific method or revealing, all the ins and outs of it. He's just saying, this is what happened. This is day one. This is day two. This is day three. So it's just a history. All of Genesis is a history. And, so no, it's not a science textbook. It shouldn't be used as a science textbook, but certainly it can be used as a history textbook. And from the Orthodox perspective, this is what happened. God is speaking to Moses face to face. He said, I spoke to the prophets in dreams and visions, but I speak to Moses, my servant, face to face. That's kind of a general idea of what he said. So just as in the prophets, they prophesy either what's happening right then and the problems with the people right then, or something that's going to happen in the future, like the coming of the Messiah, the Savior. With Moses, he's prophesying what happened in the past. So God is showing him, since nobody was there to see it, God is showing him what happened in the past. So no, it's not a science textbook, it's a history textbook.
Yeah, and I think what I would also add to that is, while we acknowledge that it's not a science textbook, that history that you describe does it does have something to say about what is a legitimate account of the history of the beginning of the world.
Yeah.
Right there. So while on one hand, it's not writing out chemical formulas, for example, or it's not talking about, the pressure of the earth or whatever. On the other hand, it is saying certain things about, when did God create the earth? When did he create man? When did death come into play? And those are important questions, because if what we would say then is, if some scientific theory suggests something counter to that, well, then we would disagree with that scientific theory.
Yeah, you're in a case like this, when you can't do direct experiments on it, you can't directly reproduce it, your presuppositions are everything.
Right.
So if you presuppose, and I know I'm going to say this a bunch of times during this thing, but it's all right. If you presuppose naturalism, that everything happened naturally, and you presuppose uniformitarianism, that the way things are happening today are the ways that they've always happened, and that's not true, then you're looking at the evidence through tinted glasses that are going to give you a wrong conclusion. So in any sort of, like, let's say, philosophical argument or something, if your starting point is wrong, it doesn't matter how well you argue after that, your conclusion is going to be wrong. So, I like to use the analogy of the golfer on the first tee or whatever, and he hits the drive 350 yards down the fairway or whatever. But if he's off by just this bit, if a swing is off just by a little bit, that could end up the ball could end up in another fairway. So if the presuppositions, the evidence is the same for everybody. Everybody has the same evidence. Everybody puts on different tinted glasses to look at the evidence. So we look at the evidence through the first chapter of Genesis. The scientists look at the evidence through naturalism and uniformitarianism. Everything happened naturally, and the laws of physics have always worked this way. So whoever has the right tinted glasses is going to, generally speaking, see the evidence in the right way. If the wrong tint on your glasses, it doesn't matter how brilliant a scientist you are. I know I'm going to say this over and over, but that's a good starting place. It doesn't matter how brilliant a scientist you are, you're going to end up with wrong conclusions.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead just a minute or so. Then the next thing he says, I'll just play the next thing. Here we go.
Now, there are many Christians who insist that Genesis describes a literal 6-day creation, okay? And literal 6-day creation as in a literal 24-hour day, 6 days in a week. And they cite as their proof the fact that it says day. That's pretty much it. That's all the evidence is the word day. And the word day is in there. The word day does exist. And the word day is true. No one is saying, or at least I'm not saying, that the word day is a falsehood or that it's a lie. It's not. But are we talking about a 24-hour Earth day or some sort of other kind of day?
Okay. So that's kind of the crux of a lot of his argument here is like, what do we mean by day? So how do we think about this?
He's right in the sense that the Hebrew word for day can mean either, and remember the church fathers used the Septuagint, which was Greek, which was a little bit different, but and maybe we'll bring that up a little bit later. But the Hebrew word for day can mean an extended period of time. It can mean, like we might say, in the day of the founding fathers, or we might say in the day of Moses, or in the day of whatever. It can mean that, and it can mean a 24-hour day. But and if you watch this, you'll see that what he never addresses is that the scriptures specify what they mean, or Moses specifies what he means by saying there was evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day, right? That specifies it as a short period of time, a 24-hour day. And he'll give, I guess we'll see some of his objections to that here, but he never brings that up. If it was just in the day of the creation or something, he wouldn't have specified evening and morning. That gives you a specific time frame. But, from the Hebrew way of looking at it, would have been a 24-hour day. So he never deals with that. I'm not sure why, but he never really deals with it.
Yeah. I'm going to skip ahead. So the next thing that we had made note of was that many church fathers are against a literal 6 days. I think that's probably a selective reading of the fathers. I think probably the majority of them actually do regard it as a literal 6 days. But I want to, just for time, we'll talk about the church fathers at some point. I wanted to kind of jump ahead just a little bit. But this is, again, where, like you said, he doesn't really deal with this. Let's hear what he says here.
Let's look at what happens on day 4. Let's start with day 4. Let me jump ahead for a minute, and we'll circle back. But day 4. Then God said, "Let lights appear in the sky to separate day from night and to show the time when days, years, and religious festivals begin. They will shine in the sky to give light to the earth." And it was done. So God made the 2 larger lights, the sun to rule over the day and the moon to rule over the night. He also made the stars. He placed the lights in the sky to shine on the earth, to rule over the day and night, and to separate light from darkness. And God was pleased with what he saw. Evening passed and morning came. That was the 4th day. So the sun just came onto the scene. The sun was just created on day 4. All of the stars, trillions and trillions of stars, all made on day 4. Yet God said, "Let there be light" on day 1. He said, "Let there be light" before there was any source of physical light. So the light of day 1 is not a physical light. It is not a light in the way that we think of it. There is no...
How does he know this?
Yeah, that's a good question. How does he know that? He's assuming that.
He is assuming that. I'll let it continue, but I don't know that the fathers say, "Oh, it was some sort of spiritual, magical, non-material light."
I think some of them might, and others like Saint Basil. We'll get to that when he's done with his explanation here.
No sun. There are no stars. There is no moon. There isn't a formed earth yet. The earth is formless on day 1. It is formless and void, we're told on day 1. Does it make sense to assume that we're talking about a 24-hour earth day when the earth is a formless void and there is no sun? Why should we think that? What's the reason? Imagine yourself standing or floating, I guess, in the midst of a shapeless, formless mass with no sun or moon or stars in the sky. What is a day in that context? I mean, it could be a 24-hour period, I guess, but there's no reason at all to assume that. Let's think about this. Let's define our terms. What is a day in our current context? What does day mean?
Okay, that's probably good for that clip anyway.
All right, first of all, what I would say is God is revealing this to Moses, right? So he's trying to explain to Moses how he did something and the time frame in which he did it. So God doesn't need the earth to be revolving around the sun to know what a 24-hour day is. He's explaining it to Moses. So he's saying, Moses, there was evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day, evening and morning the third day. All right. So whether there was actually evening and morning or not is somewhat irrelevant, because he's trying to get across to Moses a certain time frame. Mm-hmm. Secondly, what St. Basil would say, he would say that God created the light, which was material light, and he put it out there for the day, and he brought it in for the night. And then on the fourth day, he brought it together and made the sun. So you're not limited. God is not limited to, making sure that there's an earth revolving around the sun.
Right.
And one other thing he doesn't say is that on the third day, right? So the sun's created on the fourth day. On the third day, God creates all the grass and the trees and everything else, and there's no sun. So he doesn't mention that, but why wouldn't you object to that too? How could there be grass? How could there be trees? How could there be all this vegetation if there's no sun? And what the church fathers say is that God did that so that the pagans, hence the scientists, could not say that the sun is the source of life. God is the source of life. So you don't need the sun as a source of what a day is. God is the source. He can say what it is. He can put the light out and bring it back. He can just say, okay, this is how it was, and explains it to Moses in terms that Moses can understand. But to say that God can't do that, or he wouldn't do that, or be foolish to do that, why? He never really explains that, and never talks about how the vegetation can be there before the sun. If you're going to be consistent and you're going to say God can't say a 24-hour day before the sun, then you have to be consistent and say there can't be vegetation before the sun. But God's not limited. In our mindset, the modern mindset, it's all about science and physics and all of these different scientific things, and we think that God is somehow subjected to the laws of physics. He's somehow subjected to the laws that he's created, and he can't go past that. Yeah, in our puny minds, we can't understand how God could do that, but he could. He's God. He doesn't need that. He could do what St. Basil said. He could just, explain it to Moses so Moses understood it. But he doesn't need the earth revolving around the physical sun to know what a day is or to have vegetation.
Yeah. There's so much here that's kind of God could create whatever he wants in 24 hours. He could do it in 24 seconds. He could do it in no time at all. It's there's no limitation there.
Yeah, he carried it in 6 days and took his time.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So that we could have some understanding of it.
Just so we're not playing so much of the video, we also said, so he makes this argument, like we just said. First of all, we just watched, sun was not created until the fourth day, so there's no reason to assume that one day is 24 hours. Okay, but like you said, the evening and the morning was the first day, evening and morning the second day. And then he goes on to say, yeah, and a day could mean 24 hours, or it could be this extended period of time, such as in the day of Moses. You know how we use the term day in different ways. Right. But that's, again, that's why, like you said, that's why evening and morning is used.
Right, that specifies it. Like we said, he is right. Day can be used that in the Hebrew word. That can be part of the day. So that's why when it's specified like that, he's not talking about in the day of Moses or in the day of the creation. He wouldn't have specified it if that was the case. If he wouldn't have specified evening and morning, you could reasonably say that. But I think once he specifies evening and morning, I don't think you can reasonably say that.
And then he also, I think he's mentioned this already, but he also, for several minutes here forward, he says things like day can't mean earth rotating on the axis, couldn't be physical light. He reiterates that it couldn't be a 24-hour day because there's no earth by which to measure it. And he's still using science's, we define a day according to the rotation of the earth. I've taught astronomy. You can define day actually in a number of ways that are related, but you can define days by the sun going up and the sun going down, and that's actually a perfectly legitimate way to define things. But again, for him to say, look, there's no Earth rotating, and we define a day by the Earth rotating, it's irrelevant. It's not a great argument.
No, it really is irrelevant. And again, he's trying to explain to Moses whether he put the light out there and took it back or not is kind of irrelevant, because he's trying to explain to Moses the time frame in which he did everything. What does Moses understand? Evening and morning, first day, evening and morning, second day. It doesn't matter if at that point in time the Earth was revolving around the sun, because he's just trying to get across to him the amount of time that he used, and again took his time, because he could have done it, he could have spoken, and it all could have come into being. But he took his time, he did it the way he did it, and he doesn't need our scientific viewpoint of things to tell Moses what a day is.
That's right. Okay, next he's mentioning Psalm 104. And so let's watch this clip real briefly.
104. He set the earth on its foundation, it can never be moved. Must we take this literally and believe that the earth does not move? Science tells us that the earth is hurtling through space at incomprehensible speeds. It's constantly moving, rotating, spinning, orbiting. Even the ground itself, the plates are moving. Everything is moving. Everything on earth is constantly in motion. Must we deny all of that science for the sake of taking it literally? By the way, early Christians and Jews did take this literally. That's part of the reason why Copernicus and Galileo got themselves into trouble, because the Bible says absolutely that the earth doesn't move. And so when upstart astronomers started coming along and saying the earth is moving, they said that can't be. The Bible says it doesn't. Plain as day, it says it does not move. And that's why many Christians at the time rejected and denounced in the harshest terms any suggestion that the earth moves. They did so on the basis of their interpretation of Scripture, which they insisted should not change one bit to accommodate scientific fact. John Calvin and Martin Luther were two of the most vocal critics of the idea of a spinning, of a moving earth. John Calvin called it deranged and monstrous. He said it was a deranged, monstrous lie. Well, eventually Christians realized that their interpretation of these verses had to be wrong, because the scientific facts are indisputable. The earth is moving. It cannot be disputed.
All right.
All right. All right. Look, there's a difference between science, when you can actually measure something, observe it, over and over and over again. That's science. And if that's the case, we as Christians shouldn't stand in the way of that. We'd have to say, okay, our interpretation of the Psalms, which is poetry and so on, may have been wrong or was wrong. All right. But that's different than when you look back at a time when nobody was there to see it. You can't reproduce it. You can't experiment on it. And you're just trying to figure it out through your own presuppositions of naturalism and uniformitarianism. If those two presuppositions are wrong, you're looking at it completely wrong. So those two things aren't even the same category. On the one, you can look at it, you can measure it, you can measure it over and over and over again. You can do the whole scientific method thing on it and figure out what's going on. Christians should always, if that's the case and they've done it well and it's been checked out and you can't dispute it, then you shouldn't dispute it. On the other hand, we're looking at things that nobody was there to see. That's not really the province of science. That's more the province of God. He was there. He saw it. He can tell what he did. So those two areas of science aren't even comparable.
All right. Now I was going to shift things a little bit, where he's basically now talking about your young Earth scientists trying to fit things into science. There's probably also, we should probably also point out that there probably are some missteps in terms of some of the things that the young Earth scientists try to fit together, because sometimes they're arguing on the basis of science as well, which again, we're limited in what we can know with some of these things. But let me just
you can't before you go on, you can't prove either one.
Right.
right? Each one is giving the evidence that they think best supports their viewpoint, but neither one of them is provable.
Right.
So, all right.
The real point of the Bible is the Bible is all about why we're here. We're here to love and serve God. Science has nothing to say about that one way or another. We can't cross-reference that with science. But when it comes to our interpretations of the how and the whens, well, then things like archaeology, cosmology, physics, all of that becomes useful. Science tells us that the Earth is around 4 billion years old. Or I'm sorry, the Earth is 4 billion, around 4 billion, and the universe is around 14 billion years old. In order to defend the six-day creationist view, we must essentially reject the fields of modern astronomy, cosmology, geology, and biology. We must declare that all but a very tiny fraction of experts in those fields are deluded fools.
No, I mean, come on. All right, just because you're saying they got one thing wrong doesn't mean they're deluded fools and got everything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying is, in this case, they have the wrong presuppositions. But they're not horrible scientists. All of geology and cosmology, I mean, maybe cosmology might be a lot of it wrong, but all these other disciplines, they're not all wrong. It's just that in this area, they have a wrong presupposition. They have wrong starting points. They believe in naturalism and uniformitarianism. And if that's wrong, then they're going to see everything in that light and they're going to be wrong. It doesn't mean all those disciplines are totally wrong and they're just deluded fools. Right. It means in this case, they had the wrong starting point and they had the wrong tinted glasses and they're seeing the evidence in the wrong way.
Yeah. And, some of those, if you look at geology, for example, you can do plenty of geology without saying anything about origins. You can do plenty of astronomy and cosmology in the same way. It's just a matter of when the science is completely focused on how did this get here, unless you have a time machine to go and observe it getting there in the first place, that it is all about your presuppositions.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I've seen this happen many times. You notice when he says the science says, mm-hmm. He says that very authoritatively. Science says, which means it must be right. I remember, all the debates we used to get into out at Willard. There'd be like 4 or 5 guys standing around arguing about something. Somebody would come in and said, "Oh, the science says." That's that. Unless somebody else said, "No, the science really says." Somebody didn't have that comeback. That was it. The argument was over. Because if science says, even though they say they can be wrong and they change, but if you say the science says, then that's like authoritative. Mm-hmm. And that's dangerous. It can't be authoritative. Yes, if you've checked it out, if you checked their funding, if you've checked everything out, you've checked their experiments, you've stepped their data, you check all that out, then you can say, okay. And I know in some cases we've got to, you have to trust people and so on, that they're doing it right. But in this case, you don't have to trust them. You have to know why are they saying what they're saying? Like we've said many times, what are their presuppositions? You can't just say the science says and expect that to say, oh, okay, well, then we'll bow down and kiss the feet of the scientists because they said. They're not always right. They've oftentimes been wrong.
Well, and especially especially the point that he's asserting here. He says, science tells us that the Earth is 4 billion years old. Recorded history is 20,000. How do we know? So that's one of those things. If we assume that certain dating systems give us this information, if we assume uniformity, if we assume that light has always been traveling, we don't know any of those things.
No, and that's really important because if Christianity is true, right, and the world was a paradise in the beginning, the church fathers say, from revelation from God, which we believe, that the world was a paradise. There was no breaking down. There was no corruption, right? So then man falls, who's integrated into his environment, and everything falls. So it's at least possible elements began to break down very quickly at first and have slowed down dramatically over time. It's not necessary to believe that from the moment these elements came into existence, they've been breaking down at the rate that we see. In Christianity, there's two things that greatly changed the laws of physics. One was the fall, when you go from paradise, no corruption, no breaking down of anything, to everything falling and breaking down. And the other is no rain until Noah. So they said the earth was watered by the spring that came up from the ground or whatever, this water that came up from the ground, and it didn't rain until the flood of Noah. All right, so there's those two major times when the laws of physics changed according to Christianity. Now, you don't have to believe it's true, but if it is true, then you can't just use uniformitarianism. Mm-hmm. So what the secular scientists are doing is they're saying everything happened naturally, everything happened, the way things are happening now, the way they've always happened. So they take what we have now, this expanding universe, and the sun, the stars, and the moon, and the planets, and everything, and they kind of rewind the tape. Okay, if this is what we have now, what would have had to have been at the beginning, and what would have had to happen next, and what would have had to have happened next? So what they say is, at least this is what I've seen on Science Channel a number of years ago, they say that when this great expansion happened in the Big Bang, more happened in that first micro of microseconds, which I think they call Planck time, micro of microseconds, than happened in all of the rest of the history of the universe. How do they know that? They don't know that. They have to assume that to get the math to work. They have to assume that to get everything to work out. And they make a gazillion of these assumptions. I was thinking the other day, what would if you took the odds of every event happening, just from the Big Bang happening, and then all these things having to happen, more things happening than happened in the rest of the life of the universe, and everything slowing down perfectly, and everything happened, all these cosmological constants in the world, every step of the way from what they say at the beginning to today, and you took odds on every single step, most of the odds on every single step would be astronomical. Mm-hmm. That's not to mention you put all those odds together, and it's mind-blowing how big the odds would be. Mm-hmm. So, because remember, there's no intelligence here from the secular scientists. These things are just happening. They just happen to happen perfectly to get the universe the way we know it, to get the world we know the way we know it. When I first started listening to this, there was or hearing about this, there's maybe 12 cosmological constants, and now there's, I don't know, dozens of them. Things that have to be exactly right to get life as we know it on the earth. I remember many years ago now, an atheist was coming out, grad student atheist was coming out to Willard. And he was the first one that started telling me about the multiverse theory, which he said was at least in part developed at Penn State. And he said something very interesting that I've never heard from anybody else, but I'm assuming, he's in this world. Mm-hmm. He said, pretty much that has to be the case to get the odds in our favor. He didn't say it exactly that way, but he said one expansion of one universe, and here we've got this miraculous life and everything we have on the earth. Essentially, he was saying, as an atheist, as a scientist, and so on, he was saying that was virtually impossible. So we need this virtually limitless universes just to get the odds in our favor.
I remember thinking for one universe, right?
For one, yeah, to get one where we got life as we know it and the world as we know it. I remember thinking at the time, if they have to do that to get their odds in their favor, they've lost the argument, because they can't show that these multiple universes exist. They're essentially saying, because they used to say, well, the universe is so large that of course it had to happen somewhere. Right. But now, and this was, I don't know how many years ago now, I can never remember, 5, 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know how long ago it was. Now they're saying, well, you have to have all these universes to get the odds in your favor. Mm-hmm. So at some point, can't you say that just the odds are so astronomical? Now, you could conceivably say anything's possible. You could conceivably say that we're just going to all of a sudden start floating off these chairs now. There's some minuscule possibility that could be the case. So you can always say, well, anything's possible. But the odds get so astronomical after a while. When you look at the complexity of life, the complexity of everything that's in the universe, the complexity of just the life of a squirrel. I mean, these things are so, and they just happen.
Mm-hmm.
You can believe it, but I don't think there's anything about it that says we're compelled as Christians to believe this.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is you look at those sorts of odds, and then someone maybe like Matt Walsh would say, yeah, well, the odds are so remote, so God brought that together and God made the odds less. It's like, well,
Right.
why are we bothering then trying to fit our revealed religious ideas to the scientific theory that doesn't really work on its face?
And could he then say that's the science that God intervenes? That's the intelligent design thing where they kind of believe in all this Big Bang evolution stuff, but they believe that God had to help it along the way. But you can't say the science, and then say, but God entered in here, and God entered in there. And I think if he's Roman Catholic, the Roman Catholics say you can believe in all that Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution stuff, but you have to believe God breathed the soul into man.
Mm-hmm.
Well, haven't you left the science at that point?
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, no matter who you are, you pretty much got to leave the science. And as we were talking about, what does he believe about death? Now, what the Catholic Church has done, from people that I've talked to anyhow, is they say, oh, there was only no death in paradise, right? There was death everywhere else in the world, but where Adam and Eve were in paradise, there was no death, and that's all that mattered. The Church Fathers don't say that. They said there was no death anywhere. And even the scriptures don't say it. The creation was subject to vanity. The creation was subject to corruption from the sin of man. So the problem with all of this is God says to Adam and Eve, don't eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, because when you do, and the day that you do that, you will die, right? So death there is considered to be a bad thing. But if God used death from the beginning to create everything, because evolution's fraught with death, right? Then it has to be a good thing, because at the end of the 6 days, God looked at everything he did and he said, everything I did is good. That would include death from an evolutionary perspective. And now he's turning right around and saying to Adam and Eve, but if you eat of this, you'll die, and it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why is it bad now? And it wasn't bad for supposedly the millions or however many years it was that all this death is in the world. So, and so then when Jesus comes to defeat death, well, why is he defeating something that God called good and now calls bad? And now Jesus has to do it because God changed his mind and said it was bad.
Right.
And I guess you could say, well, it was only bad for humans, but why is it bad for humans? If it created humans, it was part of the creation process of humans, then why is it bad? From an evolutionary perspective, we only exist, at least in part, because of death.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now all of a sudden it's going to be bad. It's just, you can say that, I guess, but it's not. I don't think it's horribly consistent. I think it's much more consistent to say God's not the author of death. Death is the breaking down of life. It doesn't have a positive existence of its own. God didn't create anything in the process of breaking down. Just like evil is the process of, is the rejection or the breaking down of the good. God didn't create anything in the process of breaking down. Everything is good. When he declared everything good, that means there's no death, there's no destruction, there's no breaking down, because that's not good. Mm-hmm. The good is in the fullness, right? The good is in life, not in death. So that's why we believe that it was a sin of man that caused everything to break down, not God. Otherwise, you're making God responsible for death and disease and destruction and everything else. And then people rightly say, well, what sort of God is this? Right. I mean, he created this world filled with death and destruction and disease, where young children are dying and earthquakes and hurricanes and all the destruction. What sort of God is this? Yeah. And we can, and those of us who believe in the regular story, we can say, no, we did that. Mm-hmm. We're to blame for that. Our sin, when we separate ourselves from God, who is life, we brought death into the world. And when we brought death into the world in ourselves, we're no longer worthy to live in a paradise anymore, because we're corrupted, we're dying. The rest of the world we have to live in is now a world of death and destruction. But that's created by us, not God. Yeah. And when you oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's what happens when you separate yourself from the source of all life and goodness.
Yes.
Right. So it's just a natural consequence of that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the I guess the accusation that gets leveled on Christians is that we're just a bunch of like science denying, I don't know, superstitious people or something. But we hold what has been revealed because those, like you said, those things are so fundamental about who God is, who man is. You know, like you said, what kind of God is this? And we say, well, that's not the God that we know. This is not what's been revealed. It's important that we hold to these things because we're not just going to follow some scientific fad just to be so we don't get called names. We're going to hold to what has been revealed as true, because that is revealing to us the loving God who did create us and that we do want to be back in communion with. It's fundamental.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, the book of Romans talks about the creation being subjected to vanity because of us, and then when we are revealed as the sons of God, then the creation also will be fixed. Mm-hmm. Well, if it was fixed, and it has to mean that it got broken, and it's not broken if this was God's plan all along. But if God's plan all along was to make an earth that was a paradise, our entire earth that was a paradise, then we can say, okay, it broke because of us. But those verses in Romans don't make any sense if the thing was broken from the beginning. If God created it broken, and again, what sort of God is that? That he can't even create something that's not broken? Why would he do that? And we weren't supposed to die. We could die, but ideally we wouldn't have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil before it was time. That wasn't evil in and of itself. It's just that there was a certain time frame for it. Some of the fathers say it was the last step to our ultimate perfection and so on. But if we would not have done that, we would have lived forever. Mm-hmm. That's what God wanted for us. Now, obviously, he knew we weren't going to do that, but that's the opportunity we had, and lived forever in paradise. We are I try to say this out on campus all the time. God is never wrong. God is never to blame. We're always wrong. We're always to blame, right? So when they say you can't know who God is, they're saying God's at fault because I really want to know, but he won't make himself known, mm-hmm. Right? Adam said, God, the woman you made gave me the fruit and I ate it. Again, it's a condemnation of Eve, but he's also blaming God. If God wouldn't have given him that woman, she wouldn't have given him the fruit and he wouldn't have eaten it. So we're always trying to blame God. But God's never to blame. God creates paradise. God creates everything good. But we have to have the choice. If we're going to rise to the height of love and goodness and God-likeness, we have to have the choice to get there. This is all about relationship, right? I was trying to tell that to somebody again today. It's all about relationship, or maybe it's just whatever. It's all about relationship. The Trinity is a relationship. He wants us to enter. He wants us to enter into the relationship, right? This isn't just a legal thing. So the relationship needs freedom. We have to freely enter into it, right? Nobody can force to love somebody. You can't be forced into a marriage where you love your spouse. You can't be forced to stay. You have to do it willingly. And if we so we had that opportunity, we blew it. Jesus came to fix it, and here we are. Hopefully, we'll all choose to be fixed one day.
That's right.